do many workshops, many consultation groups, teaching, and Lori and I were talking last night. We feel like we're home. And to that, I thank you, and you should applaud yourselves. Thank you. Okay. One of the things I've attempted to do, Labor Day started my 38th year in the field. So the running joke is, I have sweat socks older than many of you. I don't think I've washed them. Oh, and John came home the other day, and his wife looked at him and said, I don't know how you do what you do. How do you listen to people all day? And he said, who listens? How was for you, Frank? We're here to talk about Alfred Adler. I attempt, and I've always attempted, to bridge the gap between different groups. It started professionally when I was 5 years old at home with my family. That was a joke. Lighten up. Some of you know that story. I often say that insanity never ran in my family, it galloped. And true story, 1984, my first day of my training analysis, some of you may have heard of him. Leo Lobel was my didactic therapist back at the Adler School. And he looked at me and said, anybody in your family suffer from mental illness? And I said, no, they all enjoyed it. And he looked over his glasses and said, oh, you're going to be one of those, aren't you? And I have always been fascinated by the Adler-Freud relationship and the Freud-Jung relationship. Today we will just emphasize Adler and Freud and the profound effect that had upon Adler, not only professionally as a clinician, but as a writer and a scholar. In all my years, including 14 years on the Journal of Individual Psychology as an contributing editor and as associate editor for a while of the International Journal of Individual Psychology, I have seen wonderfully written articles by Adlerians, but they all have an inferiority complex about writing. And whenever I encourage people, write, they look at me as if I just asked them to lift their upper lip over their forehead. And this is a tradition that goes back to Adler. If you look at the handout we left for you, I prepared 4 pages. If you want to see the references and the detail, this keynote is a summation of 2 separate works. If you go back there, you'll see a book from 1999 called A Primer of Adlerian Psychology. This is chapter 1, parts of it. And also, back there, is a book called Alfred Adler Revisited. And this is the introduction to that. You will see the references to everything I'm going to talk about today in those 2 books. Let us begin. If you notice, Roman numeral 1, there are the books of Alfred Adler. The ones with asterisks were published after he died. Take a moment. You will notice 3 of them are in German because as of today, they still have never been translated into English. Those segments of them have been parceled out into letter U. Thank you, Henry Stein. The collected clinical works. None of these books, other than the first 3, appear in the collected clinical works of Alfred Adler. The health manual for the tailoring trade was a pamphlet, and only 3 copies in the world are known to exist. Henry got one of them and finally made it available in English in the collected clinical works. All the others I have first editions of, I have found through hunting bookstores. And it's interesting to find the first editions and how they changed. Now, for you to be aware, if you look A through R, Q, A through Q. Adler had 14 books. Of those, 17 if you count the German. Of those, he only wrote 2. Only 2 of those are his. He wrote Study of Organ Inferiority and its Psychical Compensation, 1907. That is a medical book. I have a rare first edition of it. The second one was The Neurotic Character. All the other books were ghost-written or assembled from his lecture notes. No tapes, no transcripts. Or, in one instance, there are collections of his articles, The Practice and Theory of Individual Psychology from 1920. All the other books were either ghost-written by Baron Wolf, the American psychiatrist, who was the heir apparent to Adlerian psychology, till at the age of 30, he died in a traffic accident, in an ambulance transporting a patient to the hospital. Adler was devastated. He wanted to turn over the movement to Cruikshank, but Cruikshank hanged himself and committed suicide with no note. He was devastated again. He turned to Lydia Zicka, who had a PhD in zoology. And he said, "You're the new heir apparent." So she went back to medical school and became a psychiatrist. But while that was happening, somebody stepped up, Rudolf Dreikers, and said, "I got it," and took over America, while she took over most of the European group. The only 2 books Adler wrote were Study of Organ Inferiority and The Neurotic Character. All the others were assembled. Yet, that is the primary way we know Adler. Next, of the assembly books, only 1 assembled was by a psychiatrist, Baron Wolf. All the others were assembled by either journalists or anthropologists. If you look up their histories, they weren't clinically trained. That led to a number of errors we will talk about. John Carlson, the late John Carlson, just died. How many of you knew or knew of John? Rest him, good man. Before he got ill, he contacted me and said, "We have to correct this." So we put together a book called Alfred Adler Revisited. You see it here, which are 28 of his articles, which we think were seminal. And what we wanted to do, separate from Henry, no disrespect to Henry Stein, with the collected works, we wanted to get experts commenting upon his work from the 1920s, and a few from the 1910s in that book, in light of 21st century research and data. If you want to understand Adler, when he had control, when he was in charge, look at his articles, not these books, after you get letter C. If you want, I will give you a quick translation of the German. D, Healing and Bildung, Healing and Educating. That is a book for individual psychology and pedagogy for teachers. H, Individual Psychology in the School, Lectures and Training. And M, The Problem of Homosexuality, Erotic Training and Erotic Avoidance. They do not exist in English. Again, they were assembled for him. How did this happen? One of the great minds of the 20th century. Let us begin. You first have to understand Adler comes in, if you look at Roman numeral 2, stages of theorizing and thinking. His early work was in socialized medicine. The health book for tailors was a brilliant 15-page manual, depending on which edition you see, that was all about tailors developing psychotic disorders and how could you prevent it. And he knew how. It was mercury poisoning they were exposed to from the chemicals they were using to treat the cloths. And he said, we are wasting our time treating them one-on-one in the office and detoxing them. If we change the way the cloths were handled and we got back to the source on who was manufacturing the material, we could prevent the problems from happening and not cure it. And he coined the phrase primary treatment. And you could not study the tailors on their own. You had to see them in the context of why they were getting ill. You hear the seeds there. Then, we will get to it later, you see a second period of writing, starting in 1902. As a psychoanalyst, and Freud in his ear saying, you must teach, you must teach, you must teach. That's why you see, in parentheses, hopeful professor. I will explain why Freud was in his ear. After World War I, the inflation rate in Germany, Vienna, Austria, was 75%. We complain here when it's 2 or 3. Unemployment was at 90%. Adler shifted. He started writing as a child and family therapist. There were youth groups wandering, causing trouble, that were forming into gangs. And he was troubled. The teachers were troubled. And he starts to work with parents and teachers to head off these youth groups. Anyone know what one of these youth groups became?
The youth that got involved with Hitler?
Yes. The Youth for Socialized Politics, which became the fascists. Adler saw them coming. Shortly thereafter, for reasons we will talk about later, he changed again. And you see his writings becoming one of a social psychologist and an outright philosopher. He stopped his clinical work. That's right up to the end of his life. How did this happen? Let us start, Roman numeral 3, his childhood influences. He had an early exposure to sickness and death. He was, look at me, you will not believe this, twice run over by horse-pulled carts in the street as a child. As if once wasn't enough. We'll have, in a few minutes, something to say about his opinion and his relationship with his mother. After the first time he was run over, he developed rickets, and that his legs had to be bandaged, and he could not walk around a lot. He woke up one morning in bed with his younger brother. They used to sleep together. I will explain why in a moment. And he couldn't arouse his brother. His brother had died. They believe it was some form of typhoid, but it's sketchy. And he found the corpse sleeping next to him. Shortly thereafter, he was run over again for the second time. He contracted pneumonia. He got very ill. And a physician was called in and looked at him, examined him, and went and said, there is no hope for the boy. And he remembers his mother saying, oh, and his father saying, no, there's more we can do. He beat that and vowed to become a, quote, good physician. He was a very poor student, if you see B. He was failing. And the school called his parents in and recommended he be apprenticed as what? A shoemaker. And his mother agreed and signed off. Went home, father heard this and was furious and fought and had him checked out. And he was as blind as a bat. He couldn't see. They fitted him with glasses, and by the time he finished the gymnasium, he was number 3 or 4, depending on what accounts you read, but number 1 in mathematics. And he held that against his mother. Why was he sharing a bed with his siblings? Because his oldest born brother, notice the name, Sigmund, had his own room. And they approached him after he was number 1 in mathematics and got recommendations and said, "We cannot pay for you to go to school. We have given the money to Sigmund." And he said, in rather scientific terms, "Bite me." And arranged work study and paid for himself and went to school. Even though they gave the money to whom? Sigmund. The only one who had his own room. Sigmund went into business and was quite a successful merchant and started to become rather snobby, according to reports. He practiced in medical school what specialty? Ophthalmology. Diseases of the eye. The overcompensation. And he believed that what troubled people was their inability to see clearly and communicate that to others. And his mission was to help people see clearly. He met a woman, Raisa Epstein. What birth order? Second born, a real rebel, studying in Russia. And she was recommended to go on and was attempting to study politics and applied for a PhD and was rejected with this reason: women were not allowed to study doctorates in Russia. She was furious. She met Adler and swept him off his feet. We have a letter he wrote to one of his best friends while he was in medical school, and this is a quote: "I could not have asked for a better wife if I had made her in a lab myself." Quite a tender but somewhat scientific statement. She was a political revolutionary. Who was her best friend? Trotsky. She was brilliant, a feminist, and worked as a translator of 3 languages. They had a whirlwind courtship, they married, and 7 months later gave birth to Alexandra. Alexandra went on to get her MD in neurology. Next daughter, Valentine, got her PhD in economics. She was going to make sure her daughters were educated. And then Kurt, who got his PhD in physics, studying this brand new theory with this upstart named Einstein. And after his father got ill, he went to medical school and became a psychiatrist. And then there was the baby. Her name escapes me all of a sudden. Cornelia. Nellie, who became an actress, youngest born. Raisa said, "I'll deal with it." He was extremely influenced by 3 people, and he cites them tremendously. I will talk about them later. The 3 were Shakespeare, Goethe, and Nietzsche. He loved them and was steeped in their works. He opened his practice in opposition to his brother Sigmund in the poor part of town and worked on a sliding scale. It was called Das Theater, the Prater, the circus. And he would treat the sideshow performers at low or no cost. And he was amazed, despite the women having beards. Or as we used to joke in my family, being Italian. I used to joke, I'm Sicilian. The little people, the people with no arms and no legs, they were marrying, having children, and moving on with life. And then, on a small basis, not far from Freud's office, he had a little practice for the upper class. And these people would come in saying, my nose is off, I can't get married. And he was struck by this contrast. And then we have, say it out loud, in an American conference I am afraid to say it, letter H. Sigmund Freud. What a profound influence. Let me give you a little of Freud's background. How are we doing? Clear so far? Yes. He was a genius. He was identified as a genius early on. He was an oldest born, a loner, and letter B, read that on number 2. Of the 7 children, he was the only one who had his own room. That must have bugged Adler. Here we go again. At 8, he began his translation project of the collected works of Shakespeare. At 8 years old. He was a polyglot. Here are the languages he was fluent and wrote in. Read them out loud. Most of them before he was 15. Everyone knew Sigmund. Everyone wanted him. Schools were begging for him to come. He decided to become a researcher. I'll explain scholar later, why that's in quotes, and an author. He went and studied neurology and began a manuscript called The Scientific Project, which was never published. He never finished it. I have an unpublished version of it. This was his attempt to ground all behavior in neurology. And he began a 5-year journey to trace neurological basis of all behavior. All. He could reduce to neurons. He gave it up because the technology was not up to the time. He decided to do, besides an MD in neurology, a dissertation. They did not give him a PhD, but he did a dissertation on the biological and neurological roots of aphasia, loss of voice. Why did people lose the ability to speak? And in 1930, he won the Goethe Prize for literature. If you're interested, it was $225,000 in 1930. For his writing, he was deeply offended. He considered it an insult. He wanted the Nobel Prize for Science. They gave him for what? Writing, literature. It was a slightly backhanded slap that what he was writing was fiction. He was offended. But it was an honor. In the midst of his research, he met Martha Bernays. What birth order? Ultra-conservative Jew, very religious, homemaker, wanting tradition and a home and children. And Freud was an atheist. In her journals, she reports the happiest time of her life was marrying and having her first child. And the saddest was when Freud would not allow her to keep kosher or celebrate the Sabbath. He said, none of that will be allowed in our home. And then he met Joseph Breuer and a woman named Bertha, who became known as Anna O, the first study ever in psychoanalysis, which was not called that at the time. It was called chimney sweeping. That's what Breuer called it. Going in chimneys to sweep out the soot so that the air could flow clearly again. And Breuer began this talk therapy with a woman who was paralyzed and at one point pregnant. And in neither case was she paralyzed nor pregnant. It was a pseudo-pregnancy. And Freud was his intern in neurology at the time. And that shifted him. He became fascinated by this chimney sweeping. He went to France and studied with Charcot and learned hypnosis very quickly. As late as 1939, in an article he wrote, he maintained the couch in his practice for 2 reasons. One, it was in honor of his professor, Charcot, who would use a couch when he hypnotized people. And 2, he could not bear being stared at 8 hours a day. That's a quote. So he had them lie down, and he sat behind them. He was a loner. He didn't want to be looked at. He was afforded researcher's status, but Martha wanted more children. According to Inside Talk, he did not. But they had children, and they could not afford to live on a researcher's salary. So he decided to go into practice. But there was a problem. His first research in studying aphasia, he needed an anesthesia, and he advocated cocaine. 2 problems happened. Number 1, while it did have sedating qualities, it increased blood pressure, and many of the patients began to bleed out while under anesthesia and got addicted to cocaine. He did experiment with cocaine, not as a stimulant. That is a popular misnomer. Freud experimented with it on himself as an anesthesia. And he realized the addictive potential, and he was humiliated. They published papers criticizing him and his use of cocaine. He already had contact with Breuer. Breuer said, "Leave them alone. I will escort you into private practice." So he went into private practice as a chimney sweeper. He was afforded the title of Professor Extraordinaire, which means extraordinary. And that does not mean, when you go back and look at the original papers, that means unpaid, extra professor. He was never given a salary. I will explain why in a moment. The first thing was because of the research with cocaine. Second, after Bertha, Anna O., Freud published something called the seduction theory, where he promulgated that many of the patients who were coming in with hysterical symptoms had been sexually abused by their parents. His practice dried up. He was roundly criticized, and they were near bankruptcy. So he recanted and said they weren't seduced. They just wished they were. That is a very large controversy to this day. Was he actually interviewing people who were sexually abused? Or were they hysterical and saying they were? We do not know. On each side, you have different opinions. One side saying he sold out. The other side saying he realized he was duped. We will leave that to history and for you to decide. We will never what? Yeah. Never know. He became clinically depressed, thought about suicide, and developed agoraphobia. Did not leave the house. And he called this period his glorious isolation. 7 years. He hardly went out, barely taught a class, and would not socialize. And he began to attempt to cure himself by studying his own dreams. And in November of 1899, he wrote what he considered to be, to the day he died, his masterpiece, The Interpretation of Dreams. Sometime in 1902, and by the way, that book was roundly criticized, and as you will find out, a flop. I have the numbers on the next page. It hardly sold any copies. He decided to form what he called the Wednesday night meeting. And because I am a geek, here are some details for you. The postcard he sent to Alfred Adler was on Sunday, November 2nd, to attend on the following Thursday, November 6th. Yet they were calling the meetings. Good luck on that one. It is said that Adler had published a defense of Freud's interpretation of dreams. No matter how well you look, you can't find it. There is nothing in print. There is a defense of the interpretation of dreams from 1902, published by Wilhelm Steckel. So maybe it was Steckel. Next, there is some scant evidence that Adler, as a physician and ophthalmologist, had treated one of Freud's relatives, a cousin, and got a glowing recommendation. We have no evidence. Third, there is some reports that Freud was sending patients to Adler for medical screening to differentiate psychiatric from neurological. We do not know. But there is one thing we do know. You will see it on the next page. Of the original 7 psychoanalysts, Adler was the only one never analyzed by Freud. All the others, before they joined the group, had to go through a training analysis with Freud. And by the way, in those days, that was 6 days a week for a minimum of 2 years. And Adler never did. We do not know why. But what does that tell you? Somehow, Freud saw him as different, whether better or not. But either he asked him and Adler said no, or he never asked him. They were colleagues, and they were in conflict. Adler joined the group, and within 6 months was co-editor of their new journal. And what else was he? Can you read it? He was president, not Freud. Adler was president. He was 14 years younger. That was unheard of. To be co-editor in Freud with a man who was professor at the medical school, and that much older, and a polyglot, and a scholar. What was this upstart doing with him in his 30s? Adler began to publish a series of articles. Many of them I had put in Alfred Adler Revisited. And he began to give presentations to professionals in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Finland. It was amazing. He was going around. Freud still had tinges of agoraphobia. He wasn't going out. Adler was his front man. If you look at Adler's early papers prior to the neurotic character, you will see, and I couldn't resist a pun, I'm sorry, the seeds of hysteria are already present, but politely, I couldn't help it, I'm sorry, in Freud's language. As some of you heard me say yesterday, Freud postulated one drive, libido. And Adler said, I think there are 11. Only one got attention. There was a drive for aggression. And Freud said, there is no such thing. Adler left the group, and Freud said, there's a drive for aggression. And when they approached Adler about that, he said, in 1907, I gave the gift of it to Freud. Think about the meaning. He's sending a little aggression to Freud. But Adler said there were 11. There was a drive to see, a drive to hear, a drive to taste, a drive to urinate, a drive to defecate. And he would challenge Freud and say, what makes any of those more important than libido? Have you ever had to go to the bathroom? That's more pressing than many other things. Next. He talked about, if you notice the drives, they all seem to circle around something. I did this drawing. I've got to go quickly. Of all these drives, they wax and wane. They're called vicissitudes. And Adler noticed, tension builds up, it's released, tension builds up, it's released. There's a main axis that runs through all of them. And he called that the psychological main axis, of which the drives circle, called the confluence of drives. That psychological main axis was to become the guiding line, which was to become the lifestyle. But he had the concept as early as 1907. And last, he had a slightly different opinion of women. We will talk about that soon. After 9 years of association and Adler publishing these articles, which more and more were deviant, Freud says, I had enough. And they had a debate that spanned 3 weeks. And they debated 2 main issues. repression and the role of society, femininity and the masculine protest. And by the way, it was not protest. That is a mistranslation. The actual literal translation is masculine testimony. Protestare, which means to attest to. In the old days, biblical times, when you took an oath, where did you put your hands? On your testicles, not your heart. Testicles, protest, attest, I swear. Don't videotape that. So you attested that may you never have children and pass them on. So Adler called it the masculine testimony. Freud said that, how do you explain the fact that women occupy 90% of psychoanalytic practice? And he had a reason. You will see this in the new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. The chapter called Femininity. He said, because women lacked a penis, they could never go through the Oedipal conflict. Therefore, they were constitutionally inferior, and therefore had no morality, could never be trusted in leadership or authority positions. To which my wife, who is also a psychologist, always says, penis envy, stop it. A woman can get a penis anytime she wants one. That is her quote, not mine. I'm in trouble. Far more Raisa than Martha. Can you imagine Adler going home and Raisa saying, what did you talk about tonight with Sigmund? And Adler trying to get that across to her? He came in and said, women occupy many more positions in psychoanalysis as patients because society puts them down. And the only way they can be heard is with symptoms. They're protesting. And this is the only way they can do it. Second, Freud said that society created craziness. The more you had to repress people, the more they became neurotic. And Adler said, no. Only maladjusted people see societies repressing them. If you're well-adjusted, you can get your drives met cooperatively with people. And Freud called him naive and said he was simplistic and didn't understand the depths of pathology. And Adler responded in the meetings of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society by accusing Freud's psychology of being the psychology of pampered children who never grew up and learned to take no for an answer. That's why they had to repress themselves. That if they learned to cooperate and get along, they could get their drives met cooperatively. They took it to a vote. And Adler's group lost, 18-11. He resigned as editor. He resigned as president. The fourth Wednesday, they came back, and the 11 were told, you can't come in. You are kicked out. And they said, why can't we maintain membership in both? Freud said, because Adler's paranoid, and I don't want any association with a paranoid, and kicked them out. Adler started on his own. By the way, as late as 1931, Adler was still complimenting Freud. If you look at Alfred Adler Revisited, you'll see I referred to some of the compliments he sent Freud. He was still bitter towards him, but professionally, he would compliment him. Very quickly, they began a search for a new name. And the first name Adler chose was psychoanalysis. And Freud sent him a telegram saying, no, my name. So Adler called it, what was the first name? Free psychoanalysis. And yes, I asked Ansbacher, what did Adler mean by free? And Ansbacher rubbed his chin, looked at me and said, free of Freud. Freud protested again, he dropped the name. His next title was what? He called it the Gestalt Psychologist. And he got a letter from Kurla saying, "That's ours. Stop it." He crossed it out again. He came up with a third name, personality psychology. He got a letter saying, "That's ours." Crossed it out and came up with the name. What is it? No, read it. It was actually literally called indivisible psychology, after the Latin individuum. And it was mistranslated as individual. He never wrote it. The literal translation of our group is indivisible psychology. The first translation of the neurotic character called it individual psychology. Actually, that's wrong. They actually called it individualistic psychology, but it was indivisible. He wrote the neurotic character, submitted it to the Vienna Medical School, and it was rejected by 25 members unanimously after a 2.5-year wait. It devastated Adler. I want to read to you an actual quote by Adler about that. It's from the 3rd edition of the neurotic character. I will pick up the pace a little. My obligation to be frank puts me in a difficult position on the occasion of the 3rd edition of this book, and most distressingly so. It is for that reason that I want to make a confession here that will, without doubt, rob me permanently of my reader's affection. After a thoroughly negative judgment of this book by Professor Wagner Jadring, chair of the University of Vienna, my application to be appointed as lecturer at the University of Vienna has been refused. Because of this decision by the committee, I will be prevented from giving lectures to students and physicians. Those who know about these things will understand how difficult the dissemination of my ideas will be from now on, and will be. That's a frank admission that he expected to cost him, and it did. He never applied to medical school again. He was not allowed access to physicians. He was not allowed to teach again. And he never wrote a book again. He just stopped. Why was he rejected? Here are the best reasons I can find. The neurotic character is a clinical work, not an empirical one. And they wanted research. He did not have time to put research together. Number 2, politics and religion. His association with Raisa and Trotsky did not win him points. 3rd, he was Jewish, though he claimed to be an atheist. But just before his submission, he converted to Protestantism for a brief period. No one knows why. I asked Kurt Adler, his son. He said, "I'm not sure why, but at the time, the best schools were closed to Jews, and if we were Protestant, we would have gotten in." That is the best guess, though they never practiced. But the real reason appears to be association with Freud. They did not like Freud. Freud got appointed to teach neurology, and then switched, after he got tenure, to teaching psychoanalysis. And they did not like him, so they made him unpaid. But he kept teaching. Though he, from that point on, as you see, he lacked medical staff and trainees. The first edition of the book that was printed in America in 1917, The Neurotic Character, had an introduction by America's top psychiatrist. His name, William Allison White, who wrote a glowing introduction to the 1917 American edition. And William Allison White, his chief intern, was Harry Stack Sullivan. That is the connection. And Sullivan became head of the Department of Psychiatry at the William Allison White Institute. He came to America. The medical schools would not touch him because they considered him, says it there, a Freudian. He tried to get into the psychology departments, and the behaviorists considered him, no, The Freudians wouldn't take him. He wasn't Freudian enough. The psychology departments wouldn't take him because they considered him too Freudian. So he kept getting rejected. His wealthiest benefactor from New York paid Columbia College to create an appointment for him in medical psychology in the Department of Education. And he funded Adler's position to teach there, where he met and influenced Carl Rogers, Ray Corsini, Abraham Maslow, Julian Rotter, internal, external locus of control. He helped Maslow with his dissertation. And Adler had an idea. I'm not going to go where I'm rejected, I'm going to go where I'm wanted. So he went to the New York Times, Ladies' Home Journal, and he became the first media psychologist, psychiatrist. He was world famous. He was on every newspaper. He was being interviewed all over the place, and he had a lecture schedule of over, at one point, 250 lectures in 1 year. None of them to professionals. But the consequence was his translators misunderstood some things. I told you about individual. What did he mean? Indivisible. Next, he never said pampering. The literal translation was tenderizing. Think about it. They lose all sinew and muscle and cannot stand on their own. He never said failure. That is a mistranslation. Refuser is the literal translation. Or break down her. So it's not that people were failures, they were refusers. They refused to do something. We are running out of time, but you can hear the constant, because he did not have a secretarial staff, did not have support staff. He's lecturing 200 times at one time in 1 year. Do you hear that? And they're saying, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do this? And he's reviewing notes and saying, publish it, publish it, publish it. And the pace at which he's publishing these things, and they're selling, as you'll see on the next page. Freud's response was, leave it to America. They have horrible taste. To wrap up, if you look at the next page, Freud's sale of his first most popular work. How many copies did it sell in 1899 to 1905? I actually went out of my way to do this research. By 1919, 5,250. And then another 11,000 by what year? Adler's first popular work, Understanding Human Nature. How many did it sell? And Freud said, ugh. And Adler looked back at him and went, he got it. You see, we have since not really gone to schools of psychology. We keep going to the general public, to the parents, to the teachers, and this legacy continues. May I run 3 or 4 minutes over? Thank you. You see, Freud wanted to be a scientist. He wanted to be a researcher. Psychoanalysis was designed to be a research experiment where the scientist observes the subject and collects data and stays out of the way and does not interfere. Isn't that the researcher protocol? And you take copious notes to not contaminate the material like a researcher. Adler wanted to be a helper who helped people see it clearly and get better. All of Freud's researchers are scientists. And in starting this new psychiatry science called psychiatry and psychoanalysis, he did what every new science does. It patterns itself after the grandparent, the grandfather of all sciences. What is that? Physics. So he took the machine of the day, the steam engine, and couched his theory in the model of applied physics, Newtonian physics. And that has begun a tradition in psychiatry and psychology that exists to this day. We want to appear more scientific than we actually are. So we model ourselves after physics. By the 1930s, what was the machine of the day? The telephone and telegraph. So the models of the brain started talking about relay switches and systems. By the 1960s, 70s, what was the model of the day? The computer. So you see, all of our by computer, neural networks. It's a metaphor. It doesn't work that way. Freud started this tradition to give pseudo-credibility. Hence, psychoanalysis every 20 years goes through a major theoretical shift. Because as the physics changes, so must the theorizing in psychology. Adler saw that. He tried one book with that, The Physics of the Day, Study of Organ Inferiority. And that talks about energy, transference, pressure, releasing tension, and he hated it. And he went back to his sources, Nietzsche, Goethe, and Shakespeare. You will see, I have the references in the Adler Revisited. A scholar from Yale University, Harold Bloom, did a study called Genius, a mosaic of 100 exemplary lives, where they did research to cite the greatest geniuses of all time. Number 1 in Western culture, Shakespeare. Number 3 or 4, I can't remember, Nietzsche. And Adler loved both of them. By tying his theory not to the physics of the day, but to Shakespeare and to Nietzsche, he picked two theorists who were geniuses, who have not gone out of fashion. Therefore, why the assumptions of Adlerian psychology tend not to go out of fashion is they're not tied to the science and the technology that may change. From Nietzsche, he got the will to power, the will to see. Nietzsche had a wonderful quote from the book, The Will to Power. Memory says I did it. Pride says I could not have. Memory yields. From Shakespeare, he got the notion of character. That what makes a character tragic is you have someone with great strengths. I used to be a Shakespeare teacher. I was an English teacher in another life back in the early 80s, late 70s. And the same thing that made Hamlet, Cleopatra, Othello great also contained their tragic flaws. But those flaws are not exposed because life has been kind to them and not presented them with the situation they could not handle. Yet each of these characters, Macbeth, Hamlet, Romeo, Juliet, Mark Antony, are presented with a situation for which they're not prepared, which exposes their weakness. It is the combination of greatness with flaws and a situation for which you were not prepared that you refuse to learn from that causes you to fall. This is it. As late as 1934, he was asked, what are your greatest influences? And he said, Shakespeare and Nietzsche and Goethe. We're running out of time. I won't get into the Goethe piece. But you see, of course, some derivatives from the assumptions, some postulates from that, such as homosexuality, it's out of step. But just so you are aware, as early as 1912, Adler was saying that homosexuality was not anything other than a neuroses. Yes, that's inappropriate until you realize context. It was a crime, publishable by imprisonment. And Adler was out in public saying, it's not a what? Crime. You should not punish them. Maybe you should treat them. He was marching in women's liberation movement as early as 1902 with Raisa. He published an article in defense of the women's right to choose abortions in 1906. The right to choose. He was trying. He was trying. He got some of it wrong, I acknowledge that. But as late as 1934 in New York, I can show you this, it's from the book Cooption Between the Sexes. Adler was approached by a social worker who said, I have a male homosexual, we need to treat him. Adler did the interview and said, leave him alone, he's a good man. We know so little about this. He's fine. He's treating his partner with dignity, leave him alone. Yes, we have that story from the social worker who published it. Was Adler perfect? Of course not. But his tendency to shy away from writing, to avoid the association with his brother, to avoid the association with Freud, and his humiliation led him to be a poor scholar. He didn't check his work. He didn't check the translations. He allowed some things like the soul to come out in his literature, which is a mistranslation of Seele, mind. It can be soul or mind. You hear that? To allow individual to stay. By the way, he also did not say social interest. The literal translation of Gemeinschaftsgefühl, his community feeling, which was mistranslated, so then he just adopted the term social interest. We have a legacy to carry on. I think it is incredible that we keep the outreach. I do over 20 speaking engagements a year to parents groups, churches, synagogues. But we must also, or we will die, as Adler discovered, if we don't go to universities, we don't go to other professionals, we don't talk professional language. Adler's downfall was his greatest strength. He was so popular. But he did not train people to carry on his work directly. We must do that. We must do the key work of reaching out to the public. It is important. But we must also write for professionals. We must also get our feet in the doors of professional institutions, or we will be a footnote. Dr. Walton, I am honored. Thank you. Enjoy the conference.
Michael, I think you are a Adlerian national resource. Thank you so much. What a treasure to have. Hey gang, what we need to